I learned the hard way that living in a homeowners association means someone always has their nose in your business. But I never expected my backup generator would become the centerpiece of the most ridiculous power struggle I'd ever witnessed. My name is Gabriel Andrews, and I bought my house in Meadowbrook Estates, a planned community just outside Charlotte, North Carolina, back in 2023. The place looked perfect on paper: good schools nearby, well-maintained streets, and houses that actually had some character instead of the cookie-cutter McMansions you see everywhere. What I didn't pay enough attention to was the 70-page HOA covenant that came with the property. Rookie mistake, I know, but I was 32, recently divorced, and just wanted a fresh start somewhere that felt like home. The trouble started in early September 2025, right as hurricane season was ramping up. I work from home as a software engineer for a tech company based in Austin, and my job depends entirely on having reliable power and internet. After watching the news reports about Hurricane Francine knocking out power to thousands of homes across the Gulf Coast, I decided to invest in a proper backup system. I wasn't about to lose a week's worth of income because the grid went down during a storm. I spent about $3,000 on a quality portable generator, a Champion 7500-watt dual-fuel model that could run on either gasoline or propane. I also picked up some heavy-duty extension cords, the kind rated for outdoor use with proper gauge wire, along with a transfer switch that an electrician installed to safely connect the generator to my home's electrical panel. Everything was done by code, with permits, inspections, the whole 9 yards. I even had the generator mounted on a concrete pad in my backyard, behind my fence where it wouldn't be an eyesore. The first time I tested the system was on a Saturday afternoon. I wanted to make sure everything worked properly before I actually needed it in an emergency. The generator fired up smoothly, and within minutes, my house had power while I had the main breaker turned off to simulate an outage. I ran it for about an hour, checking that all my critical circuits were functioning: my refrigerator, internet modem, a few lights, and my home office setup. The noise level was reasonable, no louder than a lawn mower, and my nearest neighbor was a good 50 feet away with plenty of trees in between. I was just shutting the generator down when I noticed someone standing at my back fence. She was a woman in her mid-40s, blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, wearing an expression that suggested she'd just discovered a dead rat in her kitchen. She had that particular look that I'd come to recognize around the neighborhood expensive athleisure wear, designer sunglasses pushed up on her head, and the kind of rigid posture that screamed, "I'd like to speak to your manager." "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Are you aware that generators are a community concern?" I walked over to the fence, wiping my hands on my jeans. "Hi there, I'm Gabriel. I don't think we've met." "Patricia Langford," she said, not offering her hand. "I'm the president of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA board." I couldn't help but notice that extremely loud generator running in your backyard. "Just doing a test run," I explained, keeping my tone friendly. "Hurricane season and all, want to make sure it works if we lose power." Patricia's lips pressed into a thin line. "I see. And did you happen to review the HOA covenants regarding power equipment and noise ordinances?" I had to admit, I hadn't memorized every single page of that document. I skimmed through it, didn't see anything about generators specifically. And I made sure to test it during reasonable hours, middle of the afternoon on a weekend. "The covenants address exterior modifications and equipment," she said, pulling out her phone and tapping at the screen. "Any permanent installation requires Architectural Review Board approval." and that includes concrete pads and, quote, mechanical equipment visible or audible from neighboring properties. The generator's behind my fence, I pointed out. Nobody can see it from the street. But we can certainly hear it, Patricia countered. And there's also the matter of aesthetic standards. Extension cords running from your backyard to your house are explicitly prohibited under Section 12, Paragraph 4, Subsection B. I felt my patience starting to wear thin. The extension cords are temporary. They're only out when I'm running the generator, which would only happen during an actual power outage. Nevertheless, the covenants are clear. I'll need you to submit a formal application to the Architectural Review Board, and I can tell you right now that they are unlikely to approve visible power cords of any kind. She tapped something else on her phone. I'm making a note of this violation. Consider this your first official warning. Warning: for emergency backup power, for unapproved modifications and potential covenant violations, she corrected. The HOA exists to maintain property values and community standards. I'm sure you understand. She walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing there wondering what I'd just gotten myself into. I went inside and actually read through the entire HOA covenant that evening, all 70 pages of tiny print. Patricia was technically right about the architectural review requirement for permanent installations, though the concrete pad was already there when I bought the house. The previous owner had used it for a shed that was no longer on the property. The extension cord prohibition was buried deep in the document, part of a section about not leaving holiday decorations up year-round and maintaining visual harmony throughout the neighborhood. The whole thing seemed ridiculous to me. We were talking about emergency preparedness, not painting my house neon pink or parking a rusted-out car on my lawn. But I decided to play along, at least initially. I filled out the architectural review application, providing photos of the generator installation, specifications for the equipment, and a detailed explanation of why I needed backup power for my work from home setup. I submitted it through the HOA's online portal and waited. 3 weeks went by without a response. Then, on a Thursday evening in late September, I got home from a grocery run to find a certified letter taped to my front door. The envelope had the Meadowbrook Estates HOA logo printed in the corner, and my stomach sank before I even opened it. The letter informed me that my architectural review application had been denied. The reasons listed were excessive noise concerns, visual impact of temporary power cords, potential safety hazards to the community, and failure to demonstrate compelling need for the installation. There was also a fine attached, $250 for operating unapproved equipment without board consent, plus an additional $50 for each day the generator remained operational. I called the HOA office the next morning, only to get a voicemail system that promised someone would return my call within 2 business days. When I finally did hear back, it was from Patricia herself. "Mr. Andrews, I trust you received our decision," she said, sounding entirely too pleased with herself. "I did, and I want to appeal it," I told her. "Everything was installed with proper permits and inspections. The generator is behind my fence, and I'm only planning to use it during actual power outages. This is about emergency preparedness. The board has made its decision. The appeal process requires you to present your case at the next board meeting, which is scheduled for October 15th. In the meantime, the generator must remain non-operational, and we expect the daily fines to be paid if you choose to violate this directive." "That's more than a month away," I protested. "What if we have a storm before then?" "Then I suggest you make other arrangements," Patricia said coolly. Perhaps you could stay with family or friends until power is restored. Many of our residents manage just fine without generators. Many of your residents don't work from home with clients depending on them, I shot back. That sounds like a personal employment issue, not an HOA matter. I'll see you at the October meeting if you choose to appeal. Good day, Mr. Andrews. She hung up before I could say anything else. I spent the rest of that day fuming, venting to my coworker Derek over video chat about the absurdity of the situation. Dude, that's insane, Derek said, shaking his head. Can they actually do that? Fine you for having a generator, apparently so. I signed the covenant when I bought the house, so technically I agreed to all this. I rubbed my temples, feeling a headache coming on. I just don't get it. It's not like I'm bothering anyone. The thing's quiet, it's hidden, and I'm only planning to use it in emergencies. Maybe talk to a lawyer, Derek suggested. HOAs can be pretty aggressive, but there have to be limits to what they can actually enforce. I took his advice and scheduled a consultation with a real estate attorney in Charlotte. Her name was Susan Chen, and she had 20 years of experience dealing with HOA disputes. I explained the situation, showed her the covenant documents and the denial letter, and waited for her professional opinion. Unfortunately, they're probably within their rights here, Susan said after reviewing everything. The covenant language is pretty broad, and you did make a permanent installation without prior approval. The extension cord issue is murkier, since those would only be temporary, but the way the covenant is written, they could argue that any visible cords violate community standards. So what are my options? I asked. You can fight it, but it'll be expensive and time-consuming. You'd need to appeal to the board, and if that fails, you could potentially sue the HOA for unreasonable enforcement. But judges tend to defer to HOA decisions unless they're clearly arbitrary or discriminatory. She leaned back in her chair. My honest advice, try to work with them. Present your case at the board meeting, emphasize the safety and practical aspects, maybe offer some compromises. If you can get them to see reason, it'll save you a lot of money and stress. I left her office feeling deflated. The consultation alone had cost me $200, and the idea of spending thousands more on a lawsuit over a generator seemed absurd. But I also wasn't about to roll over and let Patricia and her board push me around for no good reason. The October board meeting couldn't come fast enough. I spent the intervening weeks documenting everything, taking photos of my installation, collecting specifications and safety certifications for my generator, and even getting statements from my immediate neighbors saying they had no problem with the noise or the setup. My next-door neighbor, a retired teacher named Mr. Hoffman, was particularly supportive. Patricia's been on a power trip ever since she became board president, he told me, signing the statement I'd typed up. Last year she tried to fine me for having the wrong shade of white paint on my mailbox post. White. Can you believe it? Apparently, there's an approved color palette and my white was too yellow or some nonsense. Did you fight it? I asked. Paid the fine and repainted the damn thing, he said with a shrug. Wasn't worth the hassle, but your situation is different. You need that generator for work. Don't let them bully you. The board meeting was held at the community clubhouse on the evening of October 15th. I arrived 15 minutes early, carrying a folder full of documents and a laptop loaded with photos and specifications. The meeting room was set up with a long table at the front where the 5 board members sat, and about 30 folding chairs for residents. Only a handful of people were there, most of them elderly folks who apparently attended every meeting. Patricia sat in the center of the board table, flanked by 4 other members whose names I didn't know. She wore a navy blazer and had her hair styled in that perfect way that must have required a professional blowout. When she noticed me, her expression hardened. "Let's call this meeting to order," she announced, rapping a gavel against the table. They went through the usual preliminary business, approving minutes from the last meeting, discussing budget items, and reviewing a proposal to repaint the community sign at the entrance. Finally, after about 45 minutes of mundane procedural stuff, Patricia looked directly at me. "We have one appeal on the agenda this evening. Gabriel Andrews, case number 25-42, regarding denied architectural approval for generator installation. Mr. Andrews, you have 10 minutes to present your case." I stood up and walked to the front of the room, setting up my laptop to connect to the projector they had mounted on the wall. My hands were steadier than I expected, probably because I'd rehearsed this presentation a dozen times. "Thank you for hearing my appeal," I began. "I'm here tonight because I believe the board's denial of my backup generator is unreasonable and fails to account for legitimate safety and practical concerns." I clicked through my presentation, showing photos of the generator installation, the concrete pad that was already present when I purchased the property, and the professional electrical work that had been completed with all proper permits. I displayed the specifications showing the noise level was well within Charlotte City ordinances, even during the daytime, and far quieter than many common pieces of equipment like lawn mowers or leaf blowers that residents used regularly. "This isn't about aesthetics or property values," I continued. "It's about being prepared for emergencies. We've seen increased storm activity in recent years. Just last month, parts of South Carolina lost power for a week after severe weather. I work from home, supporting critical infrastructure for my company's clients. Without backup power, I can't do my job and I could lose my income." I showed the signed statements from my neighbors, including Mr. Hoffman and the young couple who lived on my other side. None of them had any objections to the generator. As for the extension cord concerns, I want to be clear. These would only be visible during actual power outages, when emergency use overrides aesthetic considerations. I'm not talking about permanent wiring across my lawn. I'm talking about temporary connections that would be put away once power is restored. I paused, making eye contact with each board member. "I've done everything by the book. I got permits. I hired licensed electricians. I positioned the equipment to minimize any impact on neighbors. I'm asking the board to reconsider this denial and allow me to maintain emergency preparedness for my home." Patricia didn't even wait for me to sit down before responding. "Mr. Andrews, your presentation is noted. However, you failed to address the fundamental issue. Our covenants exist to maintain consistent standards throughout Meadowbrook Estates. If we allow one resident to have visible extension cords during outages, what's to stop others from running cords across their lawns for any number of reasons? The difference is emergency use," I said. "We're not talking about someone running an extension cord to power Christmas lights or a hot tub. This is about maintaining critical services during a power outage." One of the other board members, an older man with gray hair and thick glasses, raised his hand. "I have a question. What about using your generator with a transfer switch exclusively? That would eliminate the extension cord issue entirely." "I do have a transfer switch," I explained. "It's installed and connects to my main electrical panel. But for that to work effectively, I'd need to run my whole house off the generator, which isn't practical or efficient. The extension cords allow me to power specific essential items, my home office, refrigerator, and a few lights, without wasting fuel on circuits I don't need." Patricia shuffled some papers in front of her. The board will take your appeal under advisement. We'll vote in closed session and notify you of our decision within 10 business days. Can I ask when that vote will happen? I pressed. When we have time to properly deliberate, Patricia said dismissively. Next item on the agenda. I gathered my materials and returned to my seat, feeling frustrated but trying to stay optimistic. Maybe the presentation had swayed some of the other board members, even if Patricia seemed immovable. 10 business days came and went with no word from the HOA. On day 11, I sent an email to the board secretary asking for an update. On day 14, I got a terse reply saying the decision was still pending. On day 17, another certified letter showed up at my door. The appeal had been denied. The board's reasoning was essentially a repetition of their original position. Visible extension cords violated community standards, the generator installation lacked prior approval, and they had concerns about setting precedent. The fines would continue to accumulate for each day the generator remained operational. I called Susan Chen again, ready to explore my legal options, but she gave me the same advice as before. Fighting the HOA in court would be expensive and uncertain. I could try requesting mediation, which was sometimes successful in HOA disputes, but there was no guarantee Patricia would agree to participate in good faith. What if I just use the generator anyway? I asked. During an actual emergency. Then they'll fine you, and those fines can eventually lead to a lien on your property, Susan warned. They can't physically stop you from using it, but they can make your life financially difficult. I spent the next few weeks in a state of simmering anger, watching hurricane updates and hoping we wouldn't get hit by anything major before I figured out a solution. The generator sat behind my fence, connected and ready to go, while I received monthly bills from the HOA for accumulated fines. I refused to pay them, which meant the amount kept growing with late fees and interest. Then, on the morning of November 3rd, everything changed. I woke up to my phone buzzing with emergency alerts. A severe winter storm was barreling toward the Carolinas, unusual for early November but increasingly common with climate change. The forecast called for ice, heavy winds, and the potential for widespread power outages. I immediately started preparing, filling gas cans for the generator, making sure my propane tanks were full, stocking up on food and water. The storm hit that evening, right around dinner time. I was heating up some soup on my gas stove when the lights flickered and went dark. A moment later, I heard the sound of transformers blowing somewhere in the neighborhood, those distinctive bangs that meant the power grid had taken a serious hit. I waited a few minutes to see if it was just a brief interruption, but my phone was already showing alerts from Duke Energy estimating restoration could take several days. That settled it. I pulled on my heavy coat and boots, grabbed my flashlight, and went out to the backyard through the freezing rain. The generator started on the second pull. I let it warm up for a minute, then began running my extension cords through the back door into the house. I had 3 heavy-duty cords, one for my home office, one for the refrigerator and router, and one for some basic lighting in the kitchen and living room. Within 20 minutes, my house was lit up while the rest of the neighborhood sat in darkness. I settled in for the night, working on my laptop and monitoring the storm updates. The ice kept falling, coating everything outside in a thick, crystalline shell. Tree branches snapped under the weight, and I could hear them crashing down throughout the neighborhood. This was going to be bad. The next morning, I looked outside to see a winter wonderland that was beautiful and destructive in equal measure. Power lines were down in several places, and at least 3 large trees had fallen across the street in my immediate area. My generator was still humming along steadily, and I was warm and comfortable while the temperature outside hovered just below freezing. I was making coffee, grateful for my electric coffee maker running off generator power, when I heard someone pounding on my front door. I looked through the peephole and saw Patricia standing on my porch, wearing a puffy winter coat and looking absolutely miserable. I opened the door, keeping the screen latched. "Can I help you? Your generator is running," she said, her breath fogging in the cold air. "Yep. We're in the middle of a power outage, in case you haven't noticed." "You're still in violation of the HOA covenants," Patricia insisted, though her voice lacked its usual authority. She was shivering, and I noticed her lips had a slightly blue tinge. "Those extension cords are explicitly prohibited." "Patricia, it's 28 degrees outside, the power's out across half the county, and you're seriously here to lecture me about extension cords." "The rules don't stop applying just because of weather," she said, but she was hugging herself now, clearly freezing. "I'm going to have to document this violation." "You do that," I said, starting to close the door. "Stay warm." "Wait," she called out, her composure finally cracking. "How long can your generator run?" "As long as I have fuel. I've got about 30 gallons of gas plus propane backup. Should be good for several days if I'm conservative with what I'm powering." Patricia's eyes darted toward the street, then back to me. "The power company is saying it could be 3 to 5 days before restoration in our area, maybe longer if more lines come down." "I heard that too. Probably going to get colder tonight." She stood there for a long moment, and I could practically see the internal struggle playing out on her face. Finally, she cleared her throat. "Listen, Gabriel, I know we've had our disagreements, but this is an emergency situation. Several residents on the HOA board live on Oakmont Drive, just around the corner. We have no power, and with these temperatures, it's becoming a safety concern." "That's rough," I said, genuinely meaning it despite everything. "Hope you folks stay safe." "I'm wondering if perhaps we could work out an arrangement," Patricia continued, her voice strained. "Temporarily, of course, just until power is restored. Maybe you could run some extension cords to help out your neighbors." I stared at her, making sure I'd heard correctly. "You want to borrow power from my generator, the same generator you banned, using extension cords that you said violated community standards." "It's an emergency," she repeated, not quite meeting my eyes. I felt a surge of vindication mixed with disbelief. This was almost too perfect. "Let me make sure I understand. You denied my architectural approval, fined me hundreds of dollars, threatened to put a lien on my property, all because my generator and extension cords were unacceptable. And now you want me to run those same prohibited extension cords to your house." "To several houses," Patricia corrected quietly. "There are elderly residents who need power for medical equipment. The Hendersons on Oakmont have a newborn baby. This isn't about me, it's about the community." "Right, the community. The same community you represent as HOA president." I leaned against the doorframe, considering my options. Part of me wanted to slam the door in her face, to let her experience the consequences of her own rigid rule enforcement. But I'm not actually a cruel person, and the thought of elderly people or a baby suffering in the cold didn't sit right with me. "Tell you what," I said finally, "I'll help, but I want something in return." Patricia's expression turned wary. "What kind of something?" "First, all those fines you've been hitting me with get dropped. Every single one. Second, my architectural approval gets granted in writing with no restrictions on emergency generator use or temporary extension cords during power outages. Third, I want a formal apology from the board, also in writing, acknowledging that emergency preparedness is a legitimate concern and not an aesthetic violation." "I don't have authority to agree to all that on my own," Patricia protested. Then get it. Call an emergency board meeting, conference call, whatever you need to do. I'll wait. I started to close the door again. Wait, please. Patricia held up her hand. Let me make some calls. Can I at least come inside where it's warm while I do that? I considered letting her freeze on my porch, but decided that might be taking things too far. I unlatched the screen door and let her in. She practically stumbled into the warmth of my entryway, rubbing her hands together. Coffee. I offered, because my mom raised me to be polite even to my enemies. Please, Patricia said gratefully. I poured her a cup while she pulled out her phone and started making calls. I could hear her side of the conversations, explaining the situation to the other board members. There was clearly some pushback, probably from people who were also without power but not desperate enough yet to swallow their pride. After about 20 minutes and 4 phone calls, Patricia set down her phone and looked at me. Okay. The board agrees to drop the existing fines and grant your architectural approval for generator use during emergencies. We'll draft a formal document once power is restored and everyone can review the exact language. And the apology, I prompted. Patricia's jaw tightened. We'll include an acknowledgement that emergency preparedness is important and that our initial denial may have been overly restrictive. May have been. Was overly restrictive, she amended. That's the best I can do right now. Take it or leave it. I pretended to think about it, letting her sweat for a moment. Fine. I'll accept that. Now let's talk logistics. My generator can handle about 7,000 watts safely. Right now I'm using maybe 1,500 for my own needs. That leaves plenty of capacity, but we need to be smart about what we're powering and how far we're running cords. Patricia nodded, pulling out a notepad. The Hendersons need power for basic heating and baby supplies. The Mitchells on Oakmont have medical equipment for Mrs. Mitchell's oxygen concentrator. The Petersons are elderly and need heating as well. How far away are these houses? Oakmont Drive is about 200 feet from your backyard if we cut through the greenbelt area behind your fence. I did some mental calculations. I have 300 feet of heavy-duty cord, but we'll lose some efficiency over that distance. We'll need to prioritize critical needs only, no running full heating systems or anything like that. Space heaters maybe, medical equipment, refrigerators, and some lighting. That's it. Agreed, Patricia said quickly. Whatever you think is safe. We spent the next 2 hours setting up what was essentially a neighborhood power grid. I recruited Mr. Hoffman from next door to help run the extension cords through the greenbelt and over to Oakmont Drive. The ground was treacherous with ice, and we had to be careful not to slip while pulling the heavy cables through the frozen underbrush. The Hendersons answered their door looking exhausted and relieved when I explained what we were doing. Their baby, a tiny girl named Emma who couldn't have been more than 6 weeks old, was bundled in multiple layers of blankets. I got them set up with enough power for a space heater in the nursery, some lights, and their refrigerator. Mrs. Mitchell's oxygen concentrator was the highest priority. Her husband, a thin man in his 70s, had tears in his eyes when we got the machine running again. We were about to drive to the hospital, he said. But with the roads like this and her condition, I was worried about moving her. You're all set now, I assured him. Just be conservative with what else you plug in. The generator's running on a limited fuel supply. The Petersons were a couple in their 80s, both of them looking cold and frightened. I set them up with a space heater and some lighting, and Mrs. Peterson insisted on giving me a tin of homemade cookies as thanks. You're a lifesaver, young man, she said, pressing the tin into my hands. By the time Mr. Hoffman and I trudged back to my house, I was exhausted and frozen despite the physical labor. Patricia was still in my living room, having made herself comfortable on my couch with her second cup of coffee. She'd been making more calls, coordinating with other board members and checking on additional neighbors who might need help. "The community Facebook page is blowing up," she said, showing me her phone. "Everyone's talking about what you're doing. A lot of people are saying they wish they'd prepared like you did." "Maybe they would have if the HOA hadn't banned generators," I pointed out. Patricia had the decency to look embarrassed. "Point taken. For what it's worth, I genuinely thought we were enforcing reasonable standards." The covenant language about extension cords was meant to prevent people from running Christmas lights across the neighborhood or powering yard decorations year-round. I didn't consider emergency scenarios. "Maybe that's something to address when you revise the covenants," I suggested. She nodded slowly. "We're due for a revision cycle next year. I'll make sure emergency preparedness gets explicitly addressed." Over the next 3 days, my house became the unofficial community center for our section of the neighborhood. People would stop by to charge their phones, get warm for a while, or just check on the status of the power restoration. I kept the generator running around the clock, refueling it carefully and monitoring the electrical load to make sure nothing got overloaded. The extension cords running through the green belt became a lifeline for the families we were supporting. I checked on them twice a day, making sure everything was working properly and that people weren't trying to plug in too many devices. Mr. Henderson tried to run a space heater, a television, and a gaming console all at once, and I had to explain that the TV and gaming console were luxuries we couldn't afford with limited generator capacity. Patricia spent a surprising amount of time at my house during those 3 days. At first, I think it was because her own place was unbearably cold and she had nowhere else to go. But as we worked together coordinating neighborhood support, something shifted. She started seeing me as a person rather than an obstacle to her authority. And I started seeing her as someone who genuinely cared about the community, even if she'd been misguided about how to manage it. On the evening of the 3rd day, we were sitting in my living room, monitoring weather reports and power restoration updates, when she brought up the HOA situation directly. "I owe you an apology," she said without preamble. "A real one, not the corporate non-apology we agreed to for the board document." I looked up from my laptop, surprised. "Okay. I was wrong about the generator, wrong about the extension cords, wrong about how I handled the whole situation." She stared into her coffee cup. "I got so focused on enforcing the rules exactly as written that I forgot to think about why those rules exist in the first place. They're supposed to protect the community and maintain quality of life, not create unnecessary barriers for people trying to be responsible homeowners." "Apology accepted," I said. "For what it's worth, I get that being HOA president is a thankless job. You're trying to keep hundreds of residents happy while enforcing standards that not everyone agrees with. Doesn't excuse being a tyrant about it," Patricia said with a slight smile. "My husband's been telling me for months that I've been too aggressive with enforcement. I told him someone had to maintain standards. He said I was turning into the kind of person I used to make fun of." "What changed your mind?" I asked. "This." She gestured around. "Watching you help people even after I'd been such a pain about your generator, seeing how valuable that preparedness actually is, realizing that flexibility and common sense matter more than rigid rule enforcement." She set down her cup. "I'm not going to forget this lesson. When we revise the covenants, emergency preparedness is getting explicit protection." "I appreciate that," I said. "And honestly, you stepped up too. You coordinated a lot of the neighborhood support, made sure people knew help was available, checked on folks who might have been too proud to ask." That's good leadership. Patricia looked like she might tear up but caught herself. Don't make me cry. I've got a reputation to maintain. The power finally came back on late on the fourth night. I was in bed, having left the generator running on a timer, when suddenly my bedroom light flicked on with the restored grid electricity. I got up and went outside to shut down the generator, and I could see lights coming on throughout the neighborhood. People were cheering, actually cheering from their houses. The next morning, I started the process of disconnecting all the extension cords and returning things to normal. The Hendersons, Mitchells, and Petersons all came by personally to thank me, and Mr. Mitchell tried to give me $100 for the fuel I'd used. I refused the money, but accepted their gratitude. True to her word, Patricia convened a special board meeting the following week. I attended, curious to see how things would play out. The atmosphere was completely different from my October appeal. Patricia opened by acknowledging what had happened during the outage and proposing immediate changes to the architectural review guidelines. Gabriel Andrews demonstrated the value of being prepared for emergencies, she told the board and the assembled residents. His generator provided critical support to multiple families during a dangerous situation. Our previous denial of his installation was short-sighted and failed to account for legitimate safety needs. I'm proposing that we formally approve his generator installation and revise our covenants to explicitly allow emergency backup power systems, subject to reasonable noise and safety standards. One of the other board members, a woman named Janet who I recognized from my first appeal, nodded in agreement. I think we also need to acknowledge that climate change means more frequent severe weather events. Encouraging residents to prepare for emergencies is smart policy, not a threat to property values. The vote was unanimous. My architectural approval was granted, all fines were formally waived, and the board committed to revising the covenant language within the next 60 days. Patricia even read a brief apology statement into the official minutes, acknowledging that the board's initial response had been overly restrictive and failed to consider emergency preparedness needs. After the meeting, several residents approached me asking for advice on generator systems. I ended up creating a whole presentation about proper installation, safety considerations, and fuel management, which I delivered at the next community meeting in December. The HOA even approved a revision to the covenants that created a streamlined approval process for emergency equipment, requiring only basic safety documentation rather than full architectural review. Patricia and I developed an unlikely friendship over the following months. She remained HOA president, but with a noticeably more balanced approach to enforcement. When someone violated the covenant by installing an unapproved fence, she worked with them to modify the design rather than immediately hitting them with fines. When another resident wanted to install solar panels, she helped navigate the approval process instead of treating it as a threat to community aesthetics. In February 2026, Meadowbrook Estates held its annual meeting where board positions were up for election. Patricia surprised everyone by announcing she wouldn't seek re-election as president, though she agreed to stay on as a regular board member. In her speech, she talked about how the November ice storm had changed her perspective on community leadership. "I learned that rules exist to serve people, not the other way around," she said. "I learned that flexibility and common sense are just as important as consistency. And I learned that sometimes the person you're arguing with might actually have a good point if you're willing to listen." The meeting gave her a standing ovation, which I think surprised her more than anything. Mr. Hoffman was elected as the new president, and one of his first initiatives was establishing a community emergency preparedness committee. He asked me to chair it, and I agreed. We used that spring to help interested residents install their own backup systems, creating a neighborhood-wide resilience plan. By the time hurricane season rolled around again in 2026, we had 15 houses with generators, coordinated fuel storage, and a communication system to check on vulnerable residents during emergencies. The HOA even allocated budget funds to purchase a community generator that could be deployed to the clubhouse, turning it into a warming or cooling center during extended outages. The story made its way through the local news media too. A reporter from Charlotte's WCNC heard about what happened and did a feature story on the importance of emergency preparedness and reasonable HOA policies. The segment included interviews with me, Patricia, and several of the families who'd benefited from shared generator power during the ice storm. It sparked a broader conversation about HOA governance in planned communities throughout North Carolina. I got calls from residents in other neighborhoods asking for advice on how to approach their own HOAs about generator installations. Some of them were facing the same ridiculous resistance I'd encountered, being told that backup power violated aesthetic standards or would set bad precedent. I started sharing my documentation, my approval application template, and the revised covenant language that Meadowbrook Estates had adopted. A few months later, I heard from several of those people reporting success with their own HOA boards. Looking back on the whole experience, I'm actually grateful it happened the way it did. Yes, the initial fight with Patricia and the board was frustrating and stressful. Yes, I wasted time and money dealing with an unnecessary conflict. But the outcome made our entire community stronger and more resilient. It changed how the HOA approached governance, shifting from rigid enforcement to thoughtful flexibility. And on a personal level, it taught me something important about conflict resolution and community building. It would have been easy to stay angry at Patricia, to hold a grudge and refuse to help when the power went out. But choosing to assist, even when I had every right to refuse, opened the door to real change. It transformed an adversarial relationship into a productive partnership and ultimately improved life for everyone in the neighborhood. Patricia and I still laugh about it sometimes, usually over coffee at the local cafe. She's become one of my closest friends in the neighborhood, which neither of us would have predicted during those contentious months in the fall of 2025. She admits that she was insufferable during her first year as HOA president, and I admit that I could have been more proactive about understanding the covenant requirements before installing my generator. The generator itself is still sitting on that concrete pad in my backyard, ready to go whenever we need it. I test it quarterly now, during reasonable afternoon hours, and nobody complains about the noise. The extension cords are neatly stored in my garage, clearly labeled for emergency use. And I've added a few more pieces of equipment over time, a battery backup system to bridge short outages without firing up the generator, a weather radio, and additional fuel storage. We've had to use the generator twice more since that November ice storm. Once during a summer heat wave when the grid got overloaded, and our section lost power for about 18 hours, and once during a bad thunderstorm that knocked down some lines. Both times, the same network of shared power kicked in smoothly, with neighbors helping neighbors get through temporary disruptions. The Emergency Preparedness Committee I chair has grown to include about 30 active members. We organize quarterly workshops on various topics: water storage, food preservation, medical preparedness, communication during emergencies. We've created a neighborhood directory of residents with special medical needs, or mobility issues, who might need extra help during evacuations or extended outages. And we've worked with the City of Charlotte's Emergency Management Office to make sure Meadowbrook Estates is registered as a community with disaster response capability. Mr. Hoffman, as HOA president, has been fantastic about supporting these initiatives. He secured approval for small grants to help lower-income residents purchase basic emergency supplies. He revised the covenant enforcement procedures to include a mandatory good faith discussion period before any fines are issued, giving residents a chance to explain their situation and work toward compliance. And he's created a community suggestion box, digital and physical, where residents can propose policy changes without having to navigate formal board meetings. The transformation of our HOA from a rigid rule enforcer to a genuine community support organization has been remarkable to witness. We still have standards and expectations. People can't paint their houses weird colors or let their lawns turn into jungles, but those standards are applied with reason and flexibility. The focus has shifted from punishment to partnership, from enforcement to education. I've thought a lot about why HOAs so often become dysfunctional, and I think it comes down to two main factors. First, the people who volunteer for HOA boards are often either genuinely community-minded individuals who want to help, or control-oriented personalities who want power over their neighbors. When you get too many of the latter, you end up with the horror stories you hear about. Foreclosures over basketball hoops, fines for having the wrong flowers, rules that serve no purpose except to assert authority. Second, HOA covenants are usually written by lawyers trying to cover every possible contingency, which results in overly broad language that can be weaponized by aggressive boards. The prohibition on extension cords in Meadowbrook's original covenant was probably meant to prevent one specific problem someone encountered decades ago. But it got written so broadly that it could be applied to emergency situations where the spirit of the rule clearly didn't apply. The solution, as we've implemented it here, is to have board members who remember their neighbors first and rule enforcers second. It's to revise covenants regularly with actual community input, not just legal boilerplate. And it's to build a culture where people talk to each other about problems before escalating to official complaints and fines. I've been approached several times about running for the HOA board myself, but I've declined. I'm happy chairing the Emergency Preparedness Committee and contributing in that way. I don't have the patience for all the bureaucratic aspects of board governance, and honestly, I think we've got good people in those positions now. No need to fix what isn't broken. My career has benefited from the whole experience too. My company found out about my community leadership work and featured me in an internal newsletter about employees making a difference. That led to a conversation with my manager about potential advancement opportunities, and I'm now being considered for a team lead position. The skills I developed dealing with the HOA conflict, negotiation, documentation, persistent advocacy for a reasonable position, turned out to be directly applicable to navigating corporate environments. And on a practical level, I haven't lost a single hour of work due to power outages since I installed that generator. During the hurricane season of 2026, we had several scares, storms that tracked close enough to cause widespread preparation and some localized damage. But my setup kept my home office running smoothly throughout. That reliability has been invaluable for my professional reputation and my peace of mind. The neighbors who borrowed power during that November 2025 ice storm have all since installed their own backup systems. The Hendersons got a smaller portable generator that can handle their essential needs. The Mitchells invested in a whole home system with an automatic transfer switch, given Mrs. Mitchell's medical requirements. Even the Petersons, despite their age, got a basic generator and had their grandson help install it properly. Patricia herself finally got a generator installed in spring of 2026, and she made a point of inviting me over to inspect it and offer any suggestions. It was a nice moment, seeing her take personal responsibility for her own preparedness after having been so resistant to mine. Her system is very similar to what I have, a mid-sized dual-fuel portable with proper grounding and a manual transfer switch for the critical circuits. "I can't believe I fought you on this," she said while we were reviewing her installation. "It's such an obvious thing to have, especially after what we went through." "Sometimes we have to experience something to really understand it," I replied. "You've more than made up for it with all the policy changes." She smiled. "I'm still making up for it. I think I will be for a while." The revised covenant language that got approved in early 2026 has become something of a model for other HOAs in the region. The North Carolina Homeowners Association Legislative Committee even reached out to ask if they could use our emergency preparedness provisions as a template for recommended revisions statewide. Mr. Hoffman and Patricia represented Meadowbrook Estates at a meeting in Raleigh where they presented our approach to dozens of other HOA leaders. I couldn't attend that meeting due to work commitments, but Patricia sent me photos and updates throughout the day. She said there was tremendous interest in our balanced approach, and several HOAs committed to adopting similar language. A few months later, I heard from residents in communities as far away as Wilmington and Asheville who said their HOAs had used our template to approve generator installations that had previously been denied. It's a strange feeling, knowing that our local conflict and its resolution have had ripple effects across the state. What started as a personal frustration with bureaucratic rigidity turned into something that genuinely improved people's lives and communities. I never set out to be any kind of activist or community organizer. I just wanted to keep my home office running during power outages. But sometimes these things take on a life of their own. The most gratifying part has been hearing from people who felt empowered to push back against unreasonable HOA restrictions. I got an email from a guy in Greensboro who'd been fighting his HOA over solar panel installation for 2 years. After reading about our situation and seeing the covenant language we'd developed, he was able to make a compelling case to his board that renewable energy and emergency preparedness served legitimate interests that outweighed aesthetic concerns. His solar panels got approved, and his HOA is now considering similar provisions for other residents. A woman in Cary reached out about a dispute over her vegetable garden, which her HOA claimed violated landscaping standards. She used our example to argue that food security and self-sufficiency were reasonable goals that should be accommodated within community standards. Her HOA ultimately approved a revised landscaping policy that explicitly permits vegetable gardens in backyard locations not visible from the street. These stories remind me that HOA conflicts aren't really about generators or extension cords or garden gnomes or any of the specific things people fight about. They're about how we balance individual autonomy with collective standards, about whether communities can accommodate diversity and flexibility while still maintaining some shared expectations. They're about whether the people in charge remember they're serving their neighbors, not ruling over them. Meadowbrook Estates isn't perfect. We still have occasional disputes, someone's tree branches hanging over a property line, disagreements about approved paint colors, complaints about barking dogs. But the culture has fundamentally shifted. There's now an assumption that problems can be worked out through conversation, rather than immediately escalating to fines and enforcement. There's recognition that rules should serve people's reasonable needs, not create unnecessary obstacles. And when severe weather rolls through, as it inevitably does here in North Carolina, we're ready. We have the equipment, the knowledge, and most importantly, the community coordination to help each other through difficult times. That November 2025 ice storm, which could have been a nightmare of suffering and conflict, instead became a demonstration of what neighbors can accomplish when they work together. I'm writing this in late December 2026, more than a year after the whole generator controversy began. I'm sitting in my home office, which is warm and comfortable thanks to my central heating that I know will keep running even if the grid goes down. Outside, the weather is cold but clear. No major storms on the immediate horizon. The neighborhood is decorated for the holidays. And yes, there are plenty of extension cords running from houses to outdoor light displays, which nobody complains about because they're temporary and seasonal and exactly what that covenant prohibition was meant to address. Tomorrow is the annual Meadowbrook Estates holiday party at the clubhouse. Patricia's organizing it, as she does every year, and I'm bringing my famous smoked brisket. Mr. Hoffman will give a brief year-in-review speech, highlighting the community's achievements and thanking volunteers. The Emergency Preparedness Committee will have a table where people can sign up for winter storm preparedness workshops scheduled for January. It's remarkable how ordinary and normal everything feels now. How that intense conflict from 2025 has faded into just another story we tell about how the community evolved. New residents moving into the neighborhood hear about the great generator dispute, usually with some exaggeration and humor added, and they're surprised to learn that Patricia and I are friends. It's become part of the neighborhood lore, a reminder that conflicts can be resolved and relationships can be repaired. I've learned to appreciate HOAs in a way I never expected. Not because they're inherently good, plenty of them are still dysfunctional nightmares, but because they represent something important about how humans organize themselves. We create these little governance structures, we establish rules and standards, and then we have to figure out how to make them work for real people in real situations. When we get it right, like I think we have here in Meadowbrook Estates, they can genuinely improve community life. My generator is still there behind my fence, ready for the next emergency. The extension cords are still neatly coiled in my garage. And I sleep better at night knowing that if the power goes out, whether it's from a hurricane or an ice storm or just grid failure on a hot summer day, I can take care of myself and help my neighbors at the same time. That's what emergency preparedness is really about. Not just individual survival, but community resilience. Patricia knocked on my door this afternoon to ask if I'd be willing to speak at a regional HOA conference next spring. Apparently, our story has attracted enough attention that organizers want someone to present a workshop on balancing community standards with resident autonomy. I told her I'd think about it, but honestly, I'll probably say yes. If our experience can help other communities avoid similar conflicts, or resolve them more constructively, that seems worth a few hours of my time. It's funny how life works sometimes. A year ago, I was furious at my HOA, convinced they were petty tyrants making my life difficult for no good reason. Now I'm friends with the former president, actively involved in community governance, and apparently becoming some kind of spokesperson for reasonable HOA policies. If you'd told me in September 2025 that this is where I'd end up, I would have laughed in disbelief. But here we are. The generator that caused so much controversy is now just another piece of equipment in my backyard. The extension cords that violated community standards are now explicitly permitted during emergencies. The HOA that banned my installation is now encouraging other residents to prepare similarly. And the neighborhood that could have been torn apart by conflict has instead grown closer and more resilient. I guess that's the lesson in all of this. When we're willing to listen to each other, when we prioritize people over procedures, and when we remember that we're all neighbors trying to build a good life in the same community, even the most ridiculous conflicts can have positive resolutions. It takes patience, communication, and sometimes a crisis to force the conversation, but it's possible. The sun is setting now, casting long shadows across my backyard. I can see my generator sitting there on its concrete pad, a quiet reminder of everything that's happened. Tomorrow, I'll test it again, my quarterly maintenance check, and the sound will blend into the neighborhood ambient noise without anyone complaining or threatening fines. It's just part of life in Meadowbrook Estates now, accepted and even encouraged as part of our community's character. I close my laptop and head to the kitchen to start preparing for tomorrow's party. My famous brisket takes hours to smoke properly, and I want to get it started tonight so it'll be perfect for the gathering. As I work, I think about all the people who'll be at that party, neighbors who have become friends, former adversaries who have become allies, a community that figured out how to be better than the sum of its rules and regulations. And I think about that moment when Patricia showed up at my door during the ice storm, cold and desperate, asking to borrow power from the generator she'd banned. That moment of vulnerability and humility that opened the door to real change. Sometimes we need those moments, uncomfortable as they are, to break through our rigid positions and remember our shared humanity. The generator sits ready in my backyard. The extension cords wait coiled in my garage, and our neighborhood is prepared for whatever challenges the weather might bring. We learn these lessons the hard way, through conflict and crisis and eventually cooperation. But we learned them, and we're better for it. That's really all you can ask from any community, the willingness to learn, to adapt, and to put people first when it really matters. And that, more than any rule or regulation, is what makes a neighborhood worth living in.